Hello, boys and girls. We're reading another chapter of Miss Piggle this morning. This chapter is called The Fighter Quarreller's Cure, and it's about two girls that would not stop quarreling. That means fighting. Joan Russell opened her blue eyes and saw that it was morning. She saw also that her twin sister Anne was still asleep. Joan reached over and gave Anne a little pinch. "Wake up, Anne," she said, making her voice scary and urgent. "Wake up quickly. There's a big black spider in your bed, and it's on your side." Anne awoke with a squeal, leapt out of bed, stubbed her toe in the box of paint she had left on the floor the night before, banged her funny bone on the door, and went screaming into her mother and father's room. "Mother, Daddy, there's a big spider in my bed, on my side. Mother, Daddy." Mrs. Russell sighed, sat up, reached for her robe, and she said in a low, calm voice, "Anne, you didn't fall for that old trick again, did you?" Anne grabbed her mother's arm, jumped up and down, squealing. "But Mother, Joan said so. It's a big black spider." Mr. Russell turned over and yawned. He said, "Oh, stop jumping and squealing and listen. If there is a big black spider in the bed, and it's highly unlikely, then why is Joan lying in there, staring at the ceiling and waiting to be bitten and to be spanked?" he said in a loud voice. Anne stopped squealing and listened gravely to her father. But when he finished speaking, she said, "But Joan said there was a spider, Daddy. She said there was." Her daddy said, "Last one dressed gets the littlest melon," and he jumped out of bed and chased Anne out of the room, roaring like a lion. Mr. Russell sang gaily in the shower, but Mrs. Russell frowned as she dressed, for from the children's room she could hear, "That's my sock. Give it to me." "'Tis not. It's mine. Give it back." Mothers, "Anne's slapping me." "That's my petticoat. You're putting on my petticoat. Give it to me." "'Tis not. It's mine." Sound of a slap. "That's mine. No, that's mine." "'Tis not. 'Tis too." Slap, bang, crash, running steps. "Mother," Mrs. Russell said to herself, quarreling from the minute they get up until the minute they go to bed. "I do not believe I can stand another day of it." She ran downstairs and began jamming the oranges into the squeezer. Mr. Russell came whistling in to breakfast. He said mildly, "Oh, scrambled eggs again? I was hoping for sausages and buckwheat cakes." Mrs. Russell said, "We had sausages and buckwheat cakes yesterday morning." Mr. Russell said, "What about brook trout? Bill Smith has them every morning." Mrs. Russell said crossly, "Perhaps that is why he looks like a trout and his wife looks like a halibut." Mr. Russell peered at her over the top of his morning paper, and he said, "You know, sweetheart, I think that the children's fighting and quarreling is making you irritable." Mrs. Russell said, "I think it is too. In fact, it's driving me crazy. Just listen to them." From the upper hall they could hear, "It's my turn to go first, Joan." "'Tis not. It's my turn. You were first yesterday. You know you were. But last night you traded your first turn for my pink crayon." "I did not." "You did too." "Cheater. Double cheater." In came the twins. Joan looked at her melon and then at Anne's, and she said, "Anne's melon is the biggest. She always gets the biggest and the most of everything." Anne said, "You had the biggest yesterday. You're just a pig. You always want the most." Their daddy said, "As a matter of fact, ladies, I have the biggest melon because I was the first one dressed. Now hush." The twins sat meekly down to their breakfast. They had taken just 2 bites. However, when Anne poked Joan and hissed, "I've got the most cereal, ha ha ha," Joan hissed back, "Yes, but I have 3 pieces of bacon and you only have 2. Anne looked, and sure enough, Joan did have 3 pieces. She grabbed one, but Joan snatched her wrist, and in the scuffle, they managed to tip over Anne's milk and spill it all in front of their nice blue pleated skirts. Their mother sponged them off, and they left for school, red-eyed, miserable, but still quarreling. As they rounded the corner, their mother could hear, "That big tablet is mine. 'Tis too. 'Tis not." After Mr. Russell had left the office, Mrs. Russell picked up the phone and called her friend, Mrs. Quittrick. She said, "Mrs. Quittrick, this is Mrs. Russell, the twins' mother. I want to know if Jasper and Myrtle ever quarrel." "Oh, my dear," said Mrs. Quittrick, "all children quarrel. Why, yesterday Myrtle hit Jasper with her big doll, and the eyes came out, and then Jasper hit Myrtle with a little hammer out of his nice new toolbox, and the head came off the hammer. and I just told them I wouldn't have them breaking up their toys that way. Mrs. Russell said, but the children weren't they hurt? Why, I didn't notice. I was so angry at them for breaking their lovely toys. The hot doll hospital won't be able to put Myrtle's doll eyes back for 2 weeks, and you know how hard it is to get hammers these days. Mrs. Russell said, well, thank you anyway, Mrs. Critrick, and hung up. She poured herself another cup of coffee, and while she drank it, she thought about her little fighter quarrelers. Then she had an idea. She called Mrs. Pigglewiggle and said, Mrs. Pigglewiggle, I am Mrs. Russell, the mother of Anne and Joan. Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, oh, yes, the twins. Such darling little girls and so pretty. Mrs. Russell said, but they quarrel so, Mrs. Pigglewiggle. They've been fighting the moment they open their eyes in the morning, and they don't stop until they fall asleep from exhaustion. It is dreadful. Mrs. Pigglewiggle, you should hear them. Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, oh, I know. That's my sock. No, it's mine. That's my box. No, it's mine. 'Tis not. 'Tis too. You have the most. You're a pig. Mrs. Russell said, why, Mrs. Pigglewiggle, you must have heard them. I was hoping they didn't quarrel when they were at your house. Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, no, I haven't heard Anne and Joan, but I've heard hundreds of other children. You see, fighter quarrelitis is a common children's disease, and it's very contagious, but very easy to cure. Easy to cure? Oh, Mrs. Pigglewiggle, how? Asked Mrs. Russell. Well, said Mrs. Pigglewiggle, in the first place, fighting and quarreling are merely habits. One morning a child wakens and feels cross, and so instead of smiling at his little brother and saying good morning, he glares at his little brother and shouts, you've got my shirt. The little brother says, I have not, because he hasn't. The cross child says, you have too, and the quarreling has begun. The next morning, both children have the fighter quarrelitis, and they wake and begin shouting rudely at each other. It soon becomes a habit, and they forget how to be courteous. Now, Mrs. Russell, I believe that if fighter quarrelers could hear themselves as others hear them, and see themselves as others see them, they would soon realize how unpleasant they were, and they would soon be cured. In order to do this with Anne and Joan, you and Mr. Russell will have to pretend to be Anne and Joan. First, however, you must write down every single thing that the children say. Begin with this morning to take a careful record of the whole day. Say nothing to the twins, but tomorrow you and Mr. Russell repeat their quarrels. I do not believe it'll be necessary to slap and pinch, but be sure to be loud and noisy. Don't laugh, and don't let the children know that it's just a game. Look quarrelsome as well as acting quarrelsome. One day usually is sufficient. Mrs. Russell said every morning Joan tells Anne that there's a big black spider in the bed on Anne's side, and Anne comes screaming into our room. Should Mr. Russell and I do that? My, said Mrs. Pigglewiggle, that is the way Billy and Tommy Peters used to start their day. Only Billy told Tommy it was a cobra. Well, cobra or black spider, you and Mr. Russell do the same. Goodbye and good luck. After saying goodbye to Mrs. Pigglewiggle, Mrs. Russell sat down and wrote down every word of Anne and Joan's morning, quarreling that she could remember. After school, she purposely gave one of the bigger apples than she gave the other, and then followed them around and wrote down the quarreling. She stayed in their room while they undressed for bed and took notes. Fortunately, the children were very productive and fought about the amount of toothpaste on their toothbrushes, whose turn it was for the shower, whose pillow was the softest, the amount of room they had in the bed, who had the most covers, whose turn it was to turn off the light, who had the biggest feet, whose mouth opened the widest, who had the most teeth, everything. My, they were naughty and disagreeable. When she had finished writing it all down, Mrs. Russell handed a copy to Mr. Russell and told him about Mrs. Pigglewiggle. He thought it was a wonderful idea and studied his part carefully. So we'll find out the next morning what happens when they start quarreling just like the twins. We'll see you tomorrow.